Welcome back to the Forget About Money podcast. In our last episode, we focused on how to construct a portfolio during your working years so that you could be best positioned to withdraw tax efficiently and optimized whenever you reached your magic number and became financially independent. In this episode, we're going to focus on the distribution aspect of that portfolio after reaching financial independence. And Sean is here again, Carla is here again, and we are going to walk through how a person can use all of that net worth that they built up over the last number of years to then pay for their lifestyle. This conversation is going to be in a few parts. We're going to focus first on the gap years, which is represented by the time that you retire to the time that you may get some other kind of supplemental income, like a pension, Social Security, annuity income. So, Sean, thank you very much again for joining us.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, we're really excited for this next episode because I feel like the last episode was sort of the slog to financial independence, and now we get to think about what happens once you're already there. So that's a pretty fun stage of life to be in. I guess I'd like to start with just sort of a big, broad question of how you think about that gap period, Sean, and what your approach is.
Yeah, and Carla, I'll actually say there may be two gaps to think about, right? One gap is date of retirement to date of Social Security. For most people, maybe it's date of retirement to date of pension, but either way, right? So that's one gap. And then the second gap for many in the audience could be date of retirement to age 59 and a half, right? Because people worry about, well, wait a minute, I got this money in a traditional 401k. I'm not 59 and a half. How do I access it, right? Mm-hmm. So those are the two gaps. And the first tactic I'm going to mention solves for both those gaps very well, which is live first off taxable assets. For most early retirees, to my mind, that's the best path for a number of reasons. There's a big tax advantage to doing that, right? So say David builds up a portfolio of domestic equity index funds, international equity index funds. It's in a taxable brokerage account. And he's got $100,000 of living expenses in his first full year of retirement. Okay, great. Well, you say, is he going to be taxed on selling $100,000 of those index funds? Is he going to be taxed on $100,000? The answer is no, right? The answer is he's going to be taxed on $100,000 less his basis, right? He invested something in those funds, right? Maybe it was $20,000, $30,000, $50,000, $60,000, who knows, but it's something. So his taxable income on that $100,000 of living expenses might only be $40,000 or $60,000, right? So that's one way which the taxable accounts is very advantageous. But it gets better because for federal income tax purposes, most of that income isn't going to be ordinary income subject to the 10% rate, 12%, 22%. It's going to be subject to the long-term capital gains rate, which starts at a nice 0% rate. We like that tax rate, don't we? So
we sure do.
There is a way to keep income low. And the other thing too is maybe David's single and maybe it's a big gain. Maybe it's $80,000 a gain in that example, right? Well, first of all, it's still better than paying tax on $100,000. But if it's an $80,000 gain, he will pay 15% long-term capital gains tax on some of that by my quick and dirty math here. But on a lot of it, he still pays 0%. David could do very well from an income perspective and still get that benefit of the 0% rate on at least some of that. So that's where we start this conversation. And then we have to move into more of the retirement accounts where a lot of the folks are just going to get to retirement and aren't going to have all these taxable brokerage accounts. But boy, if you can get to early retirement with a decent amount of these taxable brokerage accounts, to my mind, that's the first place to play in the sandbox.
So that would mean your traditional 401ks, your taxable accounts. Is this right?
Well, no, you would first take from your taxable brokerage, right?
Okay, so your brokerage account. Okay.
Yeah, and you're paying long-term capital gains for most of your income, which means for many early retirees, maybe you're going to go out at 0% without any other additional planning. Now, this is where a lot of people in the FI community then add a Roth conversion to that planning because they say my income's so low, my taxes are so low, I might as well add in a Roth conversion. And by the way, there are some people for whom they may have to add in the Roth conversion because maybe they're living on cash instead of capital gains for the first few years of early retirement. I tend not to like that strategy as much, but that's a strategy that you'll hear out there. Oh, save up three years of living expenses in cash. We could debate that all day, but if you did, that would have a nice, healthy benefit of keeping your taxes low. And then it's like, okay, I better turn on some of these Roth conversions, take advantage of the standard deduction. Sometimes if your income's so low and you're on an ACA medical insurance plan, you might have to turn on a Roth conversion to create income to qualify for the so-called premium tax credit. So basically the way I look at it is you start with the taxable brokerage accounts, and as they get depleted, you start saying, well, wait a minute, there's not that much left in the taxable brokerage. I better switch to like a 401k, IRA, Roth IRA. And then there's separate tactics for that, for accessing those things early.
So before we get to that, one question I have is you've got your taxable brokerage account, hopefully, right? That's a very lovely thing to have to cover this gap that we're talking about here. But I'm curious if you would advise people to adjust the allocations of maybe stocks versus bonds that they have within that taxable brokerage account as they are actually approaching this drawdown phase, or as they're in the drawdown phase. Do you advise people to shift a little bit more towards bonds? How do you think about that?
So there's your global asset allocation over all your accounts. And that is, to my mind, you should do that based on all your facts and circumstances, your level of wealth, your annual spend, your capacity and tolerance for risk, those sorts of things, right? But what I'm a big fan of is, I call it tax basketing. Some people call it asset location. So recall last episode, we did talk about, J.L. Collins' portfolio. There's probably going to be some bonds there, particularly at retirement. He talks about his own portfolio at retirement. I think he started at 20% bonds, 5% in cash. Well, so I think it's a fair statement to say, look, we're not giving investment advice in this podcast, but it's a fair statement to say that most early retirees in the FI community are going to want to have some bond holding, right? And I think it's a fair statement to say most of them want to have less than half that of their wealth in bonds, right? That's sort of my experience. I'm not giving you investment advice. So you say, okay, you want to have some bonds, less than zero, or greater than zero, less than 50%. So somewhere in there, let's just say. Well, where do most people, even in the FI community, have most of their wealth? 401ks, traditional IRAs, right? So you have more than half your wealth in a traditional IRA or 401k or a combination thereof, and you want to have less than half your wealth in bonds. Haven't we just come up with a great pairing, right? Couldn't we put all the bonds in the traditional retirement accounts? And then still maybe in the traditional retirement accounts, we still have some equities, right? Roths, we have equities. And then in the taxable brokerage, we have equities. So what have we done there, right? We haven't changed our portfolio allocation. We've just shifted it among the different baskets available. And why do we do that? Well, bonds sit great in traditional retirement accounts. Bonds kick off more income in terms of interest than equities kick off in terms of dividends. So it's a higher number. And it's not preferred income, right? Those dividends tend to be this qualified dividend income. The bonds, it's ordinary income. So why not hide out that income in a tax deferred account in a 401k or a traditional IRA so it doesn't hit our tax return? The other thing that we're thinking about is growth, right? Part of the reason we love like something like the Roth is the Roth has tax-free growth. Bonds don't tend to grow that much. They grow a little bit, right? It's not like they have no growth, right? But, the tech stocks are not in the bond funds, right? They're in our, and techs are volatile, no guarantees. Why not have the growth in the Roth accounts or even the taxable brokerage accounts, and then put those bonds that are creating that disadvantage, that tax unfavored income that's higher, put those in the 401k or the traditional IRA and keep that off our tax return. And eventually we'll have RMDs to worry about, but we'll talk about that later. But that's a great way of hiding out that bond income from the tax man by putting it in a traditional IRA or 401k.
Yeah, that's a very helpful answer. So let's shift our thoughts to somebody who maybe doesn't have enough in a taxable brokerage account to cover this gap period. So I think that's true of a lot of folks in the FI community. Maybe they have, let's just use some nice round numbers here. You have $1 million in your 401ks, and you've only got maybe 400, 500K in a taxable brokerage account. So are there other ways to bridge that gap? Because that 400 or 500K is probably not going to cover your expenses, especially if you're looking at, something approaching like a 20-year time horizon.
Yes.
If you can access your post-tax accounts. Or pre-tax accounts, sorry. So can you talk about ways that people might think about covering that gap if they don't have a big juicy taxable brokerage account?
Absolutely. And so this is, hey, we're not 59 and a half yet, but most of our wealth is in these deferred accounts or even Roth accounts. How do we access that? And I've got a little pecking order. What I'm going to do is I'll send you guys for the show notes a link to a blog I did on this. The first peck in the pecking order is any inherited retirement accounts. So this is going to happen more and more in the audience, right? The baby boomer generation is going to pass, and they're going to leave folks with traditional IRAs. Most people are going to have to drain those in 10 years. They turn out to be this great asset for early retirement because you're going to have to drain it anyway in 10 years. You're not allowed to Roth convert it. So you might as well live off of it. And there's no 10% early withdrawal penalty. You could be 40 years old with an inherited IRA. You just take some out of it, live off of it. Great. No penalty. You pay tax, but okay, fine. So that's the first place I would look. If I was early retired, didn't have much in the taxable brokerage, I'd be looking at my inherited retirement accounts. And more people, that's going to be a rule. All right, well, I don't have any of those. Where else could I look? Maybe I left my old job with a 401k in the year I turned 55 or later. There's something called the rule of 55. You leave that old 401k there. You take distributions from it. You got to look at the plan particulars. They may not allow partial distributions like that, but it's called the rule of 55. People love it. You don't pay the penalty if you use this rule of 55, but it requires leaving a job in your 55th birthday year or later and keeping the plan there. You can't roll to an IRA. So that's another one. Another one comes from a episode of the Forget About Money podcast. David had Eric Cooper as a guest, and he talked about 72T payment plans. And that's a very good tactic. So literally one of David's former guests, Eric Cooper, had this issue where he said, hey, a bunch of my wealth is in an old 401k, or I think it was a traditional IRA, or 401k into a traditional IRA. It tends to be a traditional IRA. Basically, what you're doing there is you're setting up a spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet has a little calculation, and it says every year I'm going to take a certain amount from this traditional IRA. And you're essentially making an agreement with the IRS, even though there's no contract signing or anything like that. But you're essentially telling the IRS, I'm going to take this money out every year until I turn 59 and a half, or if I'm closer, or at least for 5 years, the longer of that time frame. And that's become a much better way of doing it in the last few years. There's been some law changes on that have been very helpful. So that's another way. And you just go back to Forget About Money with Eric Cooper. Watch that episode. There are other resources out there on that, but that's a great resource. And then another one I'll mention, and there are other ones out there, is the 457B. So some people work for government employers. They have a second 401k, essentially. It's a 457B. Those things can be accessed without the penalty, even if you're not 59 and a half. So that's another one. It's really just about getting intentional and saying, look, I get that there are these tactics out there that I can use. Another one I'll mention is Roth basis, right? So your old contributions to Roth IRAs can be harvested. So there's a hyper version of that called the Roth Conversion Ladder. That's another one out there. I'm not here to say I have the answer for anyone in the audience, but there are more tactics available out there than you would think based on, oh, no, I'm not 59 and a half. I can't get this money. Well, you probably can. And the 72T is something anybody's allowed to set up basically as long as they have a traditional IRA. It's a very possible thing to do.
Yeah, that should give a lot of hope to folks who are wrestling with that problem. There's so many ways to address it. I feel like there's all these different tactics out there. So yeah, those are some really, really helpful ones to highlight. And yeah, we actually just had Eric Cooper on again. Everyone should go back and listen to that episode with Eric because he does a really good job of breaking down the 72T. So yeah, that's a great option for a lot of folks, I think.
Sean, in your experience with your clients, as a general rule, if they show you their portfolio and they're in this situation, is there a recurring theme of you're like, oh, you should have done that? Or why didn't you think of this 10 years ago? Or why did you liquidate that? And this is why you shouldn't have? What do you run into in real life as far as people missteps or miscues in their portfolio management?
So what seems to be a recurring theme is the cats and dogs, right? J.L. Collins writes about this in The Simple Path to Wealth. I see more and more folks who started early in good ways and bad ways, right? And ultimately, I think it's a good way, right? It's better to have invested in some individual equities early than to have not invested at all. But I see that where it's like, oh yeah, I got all these index funds, but I also have a bunch of these old cats and dogs of individual equities. Well, why do you have those? Oh, I was 30 years old. I didn't know any better. And I'm not here to say an individual equity can't be a good outcome. And for some of these folks, it's like, oh boy, you got a big capital gain in that thing. It went really, really well. So that's a recurring theme that I see. And, I think from a diversification perspective, that's dangerous. The other thing that's sort of dangerous about that is luck. So what I mean by that is if you're in the audience right now and you are 30 years old, you buy an individual stock and it goes up, that could be a problem for you. Because now you think you could beat the market. Now you think you're a successful investor and stock picker. And maybe it was just luck. Sometimes all the market goes up sort of correlated with each other. And so there could be upward drift that just helps all the stocks, even if they're not all that great. And so I worry about learning the wrong lesson about investing in an individual equity. It goes up and now you think you could beat the market. And now you do it, you try to do it second, third time and you start losing money. So that would be one where I see some recurring themes. Like, why do you have these old equities? Now sometimes it's I inherited from a parent, right? Because the parent did that. But sometimes it's, hey, I was 30 years old and I didn't know any better.
Yeah, always good to keep that hubris in check. I think that's very solid advice. So should we go ahead and move to this second phase where you are now this magic number of 59 and a half or maybe even a little bit older, and you've got maybe some pensions coming in the door, you've got some Social Security coming in the door, but you very likely in the FI community still have like a nice big 401k still sitting there or a traditional IRA. So talk a little bit about what strategies you recommend as folks are hitting this next phase of life.
Yeah, so here it's the world's still your oyster, right? And I still like spending down remaining taxable accounts even at this point for a number of reasons. It's good to let the deferred accounts and the Roth accounts grow. They're creditor protected. Now, a lot of early retirees should be thinking about personal liability umbrella insurance regardless of their portfolio. But broader point is just that the retirement accounts have creditor protection in a way the taxable brokerage accounts don't. But umbrella insurance can solve for issues there. So that's one point. But then second, now the world's your oyster. You can tap into traditional retirement accounts or Roth retirement accounts. I'm going to make 2 points here. One is, and this is something I've been noodling on more and more, is I think some early and conventional retirees should think about strategic Roth withdrawals, right? So that's where, hey, I'm in my 60s and I've been funding mostly with my traditional IRA. Great. I'm near, it's November, December. I'm thinking about my last distribution for literally the last living expenses of the year. And I'm near that top of the 12% bracket. Maybe what I do to fund that distribution is take a Roth withdrawal. Well, why do I do that? I do that so it's not taxable. I don't kick myself into the next tax bracket. That would be something I would be thinking about. And then another one for the FI community is the HSA withdrawals. So HSAs are fantastic, right? We get the tax deduction on the way in, tax-free on the way out if done right. I mean, that's fantastic. But there is a lingering issue with the HSA we don't talk too much about, which is the death, right? So at death, it goes to your spouse, becomes their HSA, no problem. But eventually the second spouse dies, right? And then it goes to the next generation. Maybe it goes to a charity, but if it goes to the next generation, it's fully taxable in the year of death. So that's not the greatest asset to leave to the kids. So maybe what you do is you start spending that down in a tax efficient way. And how do you do that? One is, I have this saying, and it sounds like an expletive, but it is not. I call it puck me. Previously unreimbursed qualified medical expenses, puck me, right? So you track, you keep records, track your unreimbursed medical expenses, and you reimburse yourself for that. And one that I like for a lot of folks in the FI community is literally at age 65, you're going to start Medicare, right? Unless you're still working for a large employer. But most people in the FI community, 65, you go on Medicare. Well, you're going to have a Part B premium every month, right? That's for your doctors, your outpatient, that sort of thing. Why not? And right now, I think the premium is $174.70 a month on that. Don't quote me. Well, that qualifies as a medical expense. You could just take that money. Hey, every month I got $175 going out the door for Part B. Why don't I just take $175 in the door from my HSA? It's a reimbursement for my Part B premium, and it's part of how I fund my living expenses. And it's a way of starting to drain that HSA just so that we're not leaving a six-figure amount to the next generation. Now, look, if you want to leave the HSA to charity, fine. You don't have to worry about that as much because the charity ain't going to pay tax on it no matter what. So those are a few things to be thinking about in your 60s. And I think like the Roth basis strategically and the HSA PUCME, I think makes some sense in your 60s and early 70s to be thinking about.
For some reason, I'm just thinking of a joke. if anybody's pucking in their 60s, they're still doing pretty well. It's okay, I won't put that in, but that's what I thought of in my head, which is terrible, but it's funny. All right.
I think that's an amazing hack, Sean. I don't think I knew that you could use your HSA to pay for your Medicare premiums, but that makes perfect sense. And that seems like a great use of those funds.
Yeah, Carla, just real quick, my understanding on that is that Part B and Part D work, Medicare supplements don't work for that. Double check my math on that, but that is my understanding. So you just got to be careful. But I think it's I think it's a great tool to pay those Medicare premiums. And still, you still may have expenses when you go to the doctor or other medical. So yeah, you can use it for that too.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The HSA seems like a very solid choice for early retirees. Okay. Well, that's a pretty solid rundown. One question that I was going to ask you is about required minimum distributions. So I'm curious if you see folks running into those and having to pay big tax bills because of them, or is that kind of a paper tiger? The way I think about it is, it seems like kind of a good problem to have, right? If you have so much money that you're having to think about big required minimum distributions.
I love that term, paper tiger. So truth be told, most of my clients tend to be in their, late 40s to early to mid 60s. So I don't work really often with clients with RMD issues now. But I've done a lot of work on this in terms of content creation and thinking about those types of clients down the road. On my YouTube channel, I've gone through this. The RMD tends to be overhyped as a problem in the world. So what is an RMD? It's a so-called required minimum distribution. The IRS, the Congress has said, look, we've given you tax deferral on these traditional retirement accounts. We don't want this to go on forever. So in your 70s, we're going to start having you take out minimum amounts every year, and that creates taxable income. People get all worried about it. And I've run the numbers, and they tend not to be as onerous as people think from a tax perspective. But let's talk about it, right? Because it's still a concern, right? Even though I say it's it's overhyped, but it's absolutely a concern. So let's go back to that. I made a point about this tax basketing. Let's keep our bonds in our 401ks and traditional IRAs. Well, that has a nice ancillary effect. It limits growth inside those retirement accounts. So this is sort of dynamic thinking. Let's do things that give us benefits today and tomorrow. Parking our bonds in our deferred accounts, there's still going to be growth in those accounts, but it's going to dampen that growth. And then that dampens the future RMDs, right? So that's a big one. Second thing is for the early retired is the Roth conversions. You're going to have opportunities in most cases to do these Roth conversions at low amounts. And that will get the money from the traditional retirement account to the Roth retirement account, where it's now not going to be subject to the RMD rules. So that's good. And then there's a third one that I like where we're doing our charitable giving starting at age 70 and a half outside of or from our traditional IRA. We call the institution or go on the internet portal and say, hey, I have this money in an IRA. I want to send $1,000 to my church. Don't send it to me. Send it directly from my IRA to my church. Starting at age 70 and a half, that is not taxable to you. So it's a tax-free bailout of the traditional IRA. You don't get a deduction for it, but you don't need it, right? You just took a taxable distribution and made it tax-free. And oh, by the way, that reduces our future RMDs. So there's plenty of tactics out there that are not all that sophisticated. Some of them, Roth conversions, depending on your situation, can be very sophisticated, but it's not going to require rocket science to manage these RMDs. And then I've done extreme examples on my YouTube channel where, boy, it's just not that onerous. It's just not that bad from a tax perspective. So Carla, you raise a great issue. It's certainly an issue, but it's not something to lose sleep of. And I find that typically, even if you don't do the planning, it turns out to be more of a good problem than a bad problem, but certainly something to be thinking about. And why not employ some of these tactics to mitigate it?
Sounds like we're very much on the same page, and that's comforting to hear. So yeah, I love that answer. Okay. Any other tax or withdrawal strategy questions we should ask Sean before we move into our silly topics for the day?
So you do reach at some point Social Security and or pension, and or you might decide an annuity is right for you. We're not going to have the annuity right or not right conversation right now, but let's assume you have some kind of additional supplemental income. Mm-hmm. We talked about RMDs, but this would happen a little bit before you got into the RMD situation. We were talking about between the ages of 55 and 70, probably. Would you significantly change anything in your spending, the pots that you'll be pulling money from? I know you talked about it a little bit, but how does that, do any of those throw a wrench in it? Or do you just say, just spend more money and live a bigger life?
What they tend to do is throw a wrench into the tax planning, right? So, presumably if you got an annuity or you're collecting Social Security, you live off of it, right? So it's less that you would have to take out from the financial asset portfolio. So maybe it's less taxable brokerage withdrawals, maybe it's less IRA withdrawals, right? One thing some folks like myself don't like about something like an annuity is that it's an inflexible source of income, meaning it's going to be large, somewhat taxable. And not only is it somewhat taxable, it's inflexible. So we're sort of locking in a certain amount of taxable income, which makes our tax planning a little more difficult in the future. So that's something I don't like about annuities is their inflexibility. We can't say, well, this year I want more distributions and this year I want less. So I do Roth conversions or whatever it might be. Generally, you can't do that. So that's something I'm just not so fond of with annuities. But yeah, so that's sort of how I would look at it. And it does mean we can use less from our portfolio. Now, people say, well, wait a minute. So should I take Social Security early because of that? So this is another point I'll make. And I tend to argue, no, look, I'm not giving you investment advice. I'm not telling you when to claim Social Security, but there are going to be people who turn age 62 and they're going to have enough financial assets to live their life and they're going to have Social Security. So some people say, well, wait a minute, what I'll do is I will take the Social Security money and invest it, right? So that essentially I'm going to take less in Social Security, but take it earlier. So I put it into my portfolio. I tend not to like that because if you're in the audience and you're 61 years old and some change, and you have more than enough to live off of, you've won the game financially. And you've done it through these volatile assets. Like as much as I love these passive index funds, they are volatile. They're subject to volatility. Think about Social Security. Social Security is subject to published rate schedules, right? You delay so long, you get this percent increase. This is our inflation formula to increase the payout every year, right? Social Security, I would argue, vis-a-vis the passive index funds is a relatively non-volatile asset. If you're 61 years old and you've won the financial game, don't you need less volatility rather than more volatility? I would argue for that 61-year-old, decreasing volatility is a high financial goal. So how do you decrease volatility? You spend down your portfolio assets, whether it's taxable brokerage, 401k, IRA, Roth, I don't care, just spend down those assets to live your life. And by doing that, you delay collecting Social Security. So by delaying, every year you delay, they increase by a percentage the amount you'll collect every year. So you're building up your non-volatile, what's essentially a future income stream. So I like, the Social Security claiming decisions, a whole other episode or episodes. But in a general sense, I like, for those who have won financially, I like delaying Social Security so that we live off the volatile assets, thus artificially reducing them, and then build up the non-volatile asset by delaying Social Security.
I think that's a reasonable tactic. Yeah, I have not heard anyone phrase it quite like that before, but that makes sense to me. I will noodle on that approach for our own planning for the future. But yeah, I really like that, Sean. I think that's smart.
Yeah, Sean, we had a very impressive woman on this podcast, Emma Von Wisey. I'm not sure if you know who that person is, but she explained Social Security to me in a way that she's probably almost half my age, and she's wise beyond her years, and she was able to communicate that understanding. So if you're listening to this and you're still not worried, if you're wondering about when to claim Social Security, go back and listen to that episode. I learned a whole lot during that episode.
Yeah, Emma's the best by any measure. She's a very, very impressive young lady.
Sean, I think we've talked enough money nerd stuff for this episode. Can we please move on to something else?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so this is a topic that I proposed, and I'm just quite curious to hear your answers to this. So here's the backstory to this question. When I was I don't know how old I was when the movie What Women Want came out, but I remember watching that movie. And if you haven't seen it, the basic plot is that Mel Gibson can now hear what women are thinking. He can actually hear their thoughts. And the way that that inner monologue of like women's thoughts that we hear throughout the movie, like the way it played out, I just remember being so surprised by it and thinking, wait, is there something wrong with me? Is my inner monologue different from everyone else's? So I'm really curious what goes on in your heads when you are not talking or writing. What is your just like normal day-to-day inner monologue like?
In this conversation, I generally don't have an inner monologue going on other than like maybe it's like, all right, Carla said something. I'm like, all right, I got to say some point. So that'll pop into my head. I work from home during the day and no one's here, right? So or if I go on a walk or I'm go to the grocery store, absolutely I have an inner monologue going on 100%. And, like you said, sometimes I will reduce things to paper. So I'll say, okay, for this project, I'm thinking about, I got to pull out my iPhone or something just to jot it down. But for the most part, I'm like thinking even those arguments through in my head versus putting on a paper or on a computer screen. I wish I had like less of an inner monologue going on sometimes, but absolutely I've got an inner monologue. No, it varies and maybe I'll daydream to some sequence of events. But I would argue it's probably more of like a monologue than a sequence of events.
Does it have a particular accent, Sean?
Oh, yeah. Is it like your voice? Do you hear your voice in your head?
Is it like your mom's voice yelling at you saying,
I think it's my
you be
voice.
Better, son?
And I'm not even sure I would say if it's a voice, it's my voice. It wouldn't be somebody else's voice, right? It's not James Earl Jones or something like that.
Oh, damn it.
That would be very cool. That's my new life goal, is to have an inner monologue of James Earl Jones. Okay, David, what about you?
I think, so I knew this was coming and I was like, okay, what would mine be? And I think it would be, it's like how would I characterize my inner monologue? It would probably be like a Sam Elliott, wise, grizzly, slightly Southern accent, cowboy type voice. And like from that matter of fact, but a little bit deep and wise perspective. So for example, if I'm having trouble or challenges with my son from a parenting standpoint, that inner monologue might be like, listen here, partner. Kids don't need you to be perfect. They just need you to keep on showing up and trying or something like that. Or if it was, I'm getting older, my back hurts here and there. Like after I get up from this chair, I'm going to stretch out, I'm sure. So Sam Elliott would just be right there in my ear saying, that back creaks and those knees groan because you put in your time. And it's a reminder that you got a lot more time to put in. Something like that. That's like, that'd be my inner monologue. I think that's an entertaining way.
Is that a thing that actually happens though? Like, do you really, like if you get out on the floor and are doing some stretches, you're actually hearing Sam Elliott?
Yeah. He's like, I'm way cooler than that. I'm glad that didn't happen to me.
Oh, this is great. I just love this idea that it's kind of different for all of us. Yeah. I feel like I have to be focused on like a specific problem for me to have an inner monologue. And then, if I am like really focusing on a specific problem, I find it so much healthier, like easier for me to just sit down and write. And then I can work through something much more easily. Goofy topic number 2 for the day is, are there any conspiracy theories that you either actually believe in or just kind of a fan of?
I'll go first. And, I found this to be a little challenging because, the forget about money ethos is good natured. But then we're also talking about conspiracy theories. So I was like, oh boy, that's a bit of a contradiction. But I found one that is both good-natured and highly sinister.
Ooh.
So remember growing up, right? You'd go to the hotel, you'd go to the Holiday Inn Express. And what they have in the morning, they had continental breakfast, right? It was like, oh, they got continental breakfast. And I'll make a waffle, which turns out those are pretty unhealthy for you, but okay, fine. They had continental breakfast, right, at the hotel. And then this is like about 10 years ago. There was a show, Key and Peele, on Comedy Central.
Love them.
And Jordan Peele has this character. I think he's called the Continental. And he goes to a hotel continental breakfast. And it's on YouTube. Hilarity ensues. It's so well done. And it's such a good commentary about continental breakfasts in hotels. All right. So that happens. And what happens like in the next year until this day? You never hear hotels calling their free breakfast continental breakfast anymore. Like it was like that thing aired. And I think there was a meeting between like the Marriott guy, like Mr. Marriott, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Hyatt, like people they don't even show to the public. And they're like, yep, we got to put the kibosh. It cannot be called Continental Breakfast anymore. Jordan Peele roasted it. And so now it's called like, oh, we have breakfast at the hotel. It'll say like hotel breakfast or breakfast. They dropped a term, Continental Breakfast, because Jordan Peele did such a funny YouTube, or it was on his show, and now it's like all over YouTube. I think there was like some reaction from the hotel industry to that skit. By the way, you should watch the video. It is hysterical.
Yeah, I'm going to do that as soon as we stop recording here today. That sounds amazing. Is that really true? I had not noticed that they'd stopped calling it Continental Breakfast.
No. I'm just saying, all I do is connect dots, right? That's all I'm doing here. I'm just connecting dots, right?
Spoken like a true conspiracy theorist.
Okay, David, what about you?
I am such a practical matter of fact. Like I need real facts. So I do not spend time thinking about conspiracy theories. However, there have been some things that turned out, you're like, okay, maybe that could happen. Like, I mean, I don't want to say I don't know if I can say Illuminati. Can you say that on a YouTube video and not get like searched out for somehow?
We're definitely going to get canceled now.
I'm definitely going to mute that part out. As we see things unfold in our lifetimes, and then you get a little bit of wisdom and your observation skills and you connect the dots like Sean says. I don't think it's unheard of to think that there are some forces out there in high positions who operate at a different set of rules that help shape our everyday for their own gain or for whatever gain.
Yeah, I can't completely disagree with that. I'm very much with you. I like cold, hard facts, and I don't, as a rule, believe in anything that's kind of fanciful. But I do think conspiracy theories in general are just kind of fun and entertaining. So one that I read about recently was subliminal messaging as advertising, and that's something that, companies do. And I mean, that in a way is not really a conspiracy theory at all. We know that happens. It's called product placement, right? That's a thing that we all are very aware of, but it is kind of sneaky. And yeah, sometimes it's done more subtly than others. And when it's done subtly, it can kind of feel like subliminal messaging. I think a fun example of that is that in the movie Fight Club, there is a Starbucks cup in every shot of the movie. I haven't seen it in a while. I kind of want to go back and watch it with an eye for that now. But apparently that's true. And yeah, I don't know. I'm not a coffee person, but maybe you really feel like having some Starbucks coffee after you watch Fight Club. But I will say the one that I really, really wish were true is the Loch Ness Monster. I just think it's so cool. Yeah. I know it's almost certainly not real, but man, that would be pretty fun if we had an actual Nessie. So I'm going to hold out hope for Nessie to surface one day.
That would be pretty cool.
That would be pretty cool.
I'm sure Disney will make, if they haven't already, they'll make some kind of movie about it.
Yeah, I will see that. Agree.
9/11 was an inside job. True or false?
I've got questions about 9/11. Building 7, let's just put it that way. I think Building 7 is an interesting thing. I am not here to make an authoritative statement, but I think Building 7 is an interesting thing to look at.
I don't know what Building 7 is, so I'm totally in the dark here. From where I sit, I think it was not an inside job.
The JFK assassination. Was there a second shooter or not?
Oh, I do not believe Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And I would bet, if I had to bet money, he probably wasn't even a shooter. That's my guess.
Interesting. Okay, my answer to this is I don't even care, because Oliver Stone did such an amazing job of presenting it as a conspiracy theory in the movie JFK that he won me over. And that's the reality that I would like to live in, no matter what's real. But I don't know. I'm from Dallas. I lived in Dallas for most of my life. And at one point we lived about a block away from the grassy knoll and, where everything happened. But I just think the whole thing is very interesting. Also, I have a minor crush on Kevin Costner, so that helps.
Very convincing.
Wait, you're getting out of answering these questions, David. What's your answer?
We have 2 more. Big pharma conspiracies. Cures for cancer and HIV exist, but are hidden. True or false?
Yeah, anything I say is not medical advice. On that stuff, I think we should be focused a lot more on preventions than cures. So in that sense, I think Americans over medicalize their problems. So I think that's where, I'm not here to say there couldn't be cures that are being hidden. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we ought to focus a lot more on prevention than on cures. I think we say, oh, we have a medical problem, we need to see somebody in a lab coat. And I think that's the wrong approach.
Yeah, I have never heard of this. I feel like, I know people say HIV is not a death sentence anymore. I feel like they've gotten the treatments to a much better point. So I question the underlying premise of this conspiracy theory. I'm not sure. I don't know.
I will answer this last one. True or false? The Earth is a flat disk and evidence supporting its roundness is a hoax.
No, I certainly think we're a sphere, right? It's a round object. I do not believe, I certainly believe that the Earth would be round, and it's pretty, I guess it juts out a little bit at the poles, right? So it's not like a perfect circle, but it's or perfect, whatever that is, but pretty close.
Yeah, I am team sphere pretty firmly. I just think it's so silly. Like, what a weird thing to get fixated on. I also just struggle to understand. You can look up at the moon and with your naked eye pretty clearly make out that it's a sphere. Like, we know that from photos of other planets that they're spheres. Why do we think that we're this weird exception, that we're not a sphere? Also, if you just think about the way that gravity works and the way that stuff like gloms together as it's forming, just makes a lot of sense that it would be something spherical-ish. So yeah, this is one that I just cannot understand. It's not even a fun one like the Loch Ness Monster. Like, what's fun about the fact that we're on a flat disk as opposed to a round sphere? I don't get it. Don't get it at all.
Well, it's not fun because the Earth is flat, and if you keep going, you're going to fall off. Okay, I don't really believe in physics or science or geometry, so it's flat. I don't see how anybody really can prove otherwise.
Okay.
All right, so that wraps up this episode of Facts. No, of course it's round.
Good clarification. Yeah, this really was a great episode, Sean. All your wisdom and insights, I think, will be helpful to so many people. And thanks for indulging us and being a little silly here at the end. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, guys.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will catch you next episode. Thanks so much for tuning in, everybody.
Thanks, Sean. And thank you all for continuing to tune in and listen to our shenanigans. We'll talk to you again soon.